Hello, y'all. It's me, it's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. Imagine this. It's April of 1853. You are Amelia Stewart Knight, the mother of 7 children, and you are pregnant with your 8th. You've just packed your life into a covered wagon in Iowa, and you're staring down the barrel of a 2,000-mile journey to Oregon. The weather is miserable. In your diary, you write, quote, "Cold and cloudy this morning and everybody out of humor. Almira says she wished she was home, and I say ditto. Home sweet home." End quote. You are surrounded by mud, sick children, and the constant threat of disaster. Yet you are also part of something immense. A few weeks later, you look out across a river crossing and you note, quote, "There are 300 or more wagons in sight, and as far as the eye can reach, the bottom is covered on each side of the river with cattle and horses." End quote. What could possibly have motivated millions of Americans, people like Amelia Knight, to endure such hardship moving westward? What powerful idea was pulling them to the west, convincing them that this brutal, dangerous journey was not a choice, but a calling? The answer is a phrase that sounds both grand and ominous: manifest destiny. In this episode, we're going to explore the belief that the United States was divinely ordained by God to conquer the continent. We'll unpack its justifications, witness its violent consequences, and see how a single idea, a mix of high-minded idealism and brutal racial logic, set the stage for the American Civil War. So let's go. The idea of American expansion westward was not new, of course. We've seen it before in our previous episodes. It was baked into the colonial project right from the very start. But in the 1840s, this long-standing game and impulse got itself a new name, a new slogan, a new brand, if you will. It came from the pen of a New York editor, a man named John Lewis O'Sullivan. He wrote in an 1845 essay for the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, and O'Sullivan was arguing for the annexation of the Republic of Texas. He blasted European nations for trying to interfere, writing that they were attempting to check, and here's the famous line from that quote, "the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions." End quote. There it is. Manifest destiny. Manifest meaning obvious or clear, destiny meaning inevitable, fated. O'Sullivan had bottled lightning, quite literally. Well, maybe not literally. He gave a name, though, to the belief that was already deeply felt across the country, that the United States was on a special mission from God. As our textbook outlines, this doctrine rested on 3 core pillars, 3 articles of faith. The first was the belief that the strength of American values and institutions, namely democracy, Protestantism, and liberty, justified the claim, the moral claim, to be the leaders of this hemisphere and quite possibly the world. The second was that the lands to the west were destined for improvement, both politically and agriculturally, and specifically in the American style. The thinking went that the people already living there, Native Americans and Mexicans, were not using the land to its fullest potential and thus needed to be shown the right way, or removed so that the right people could do that in the right way. And third was the conviction that God and the Constitution had ordained this mission. This wasn't simply something political. It was a sacred religious duty to redeem the continent, to democratize the continent the American way. But we have to be careful right here. When O'Sullivan and others talked about spreading democracy and freedom, they didn't mean it universally. Theirs was a vision with a very specific racial lens. The language of providence and progress served as a convenient, high-minded justification for what was, at its core, a project of racial conquest. While O'Sullivan spoke of a divine mission, he also wrote of the, quote, irresistible army of Anglo-Saxon emigration pouring down into California. This wasn't an accident. The improvement of the lands, in his words, was seen as a task for a very specific people, white Anglo-Saxon Americans, his irresistible army of Anglo-Saxons, as he put it. By the 1850s, historians argue that American expansionism was driven by a virulent new form of racial ideology, Anglo-Saxonism. This wasn't just simple prejudice, it was a scientific belief, scientific in quotation marks, that Anglo-Saxon race was innately superior to all other races, and more specifically, that it was higher in the hierarchy than Black, Native American, and Mexicans, whom they viewed as biologically inferior, and that they were doomed to be displaced, or that they were doomed to be dominated and enslaved. So when the expansionists said that Providence had, quote, allotted the continent to them, they meant it had been given to the superior Anglo-Saxon race, and those were their words. The language of this divine mission to spread liberty was fused with a racial mission to ensure Anglo-Saxon dominance, or white supremacy. This progress they envisioned was predicated on the belief that non-white peoples were incapable of self-government or of properly using the land. This potent brew of nationalism, racialism, and quasi-religious fervor was championed by a political force known as Young America movement. Strongest in the Democratic Party, this movement saw the expansion as a way to unify the nation, to distract from the growing bitter divisions over slavery by focusing on a shared project of national greatness and economic interdependence. The great thinker Ralph Waldo Emerson captured the spirit of this new movement, asking, quote, in every age of the world there has been a leading nation. Which should be the nation but these states? Who should lead the leaders but the young Americans? End quote. But not everyone was so captivated. A young Whig congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln saw the hypocrisy. He satirized the young Americans, saying his, quote, desire for land is not selfish, but merely an impulse to extend the area of freedom. He is very anxious to fight for the liberation of enslaved nations and colonies, provided always they have land, end quote. Lincoln put his finger on the central contradiction. This grand mission of liberty was, in practice, a mission for land, a mission that would run roughshod over anyone who stood in its way. So what happens then when the idea of manifest destiny, armed with a sense of divine and racial superiority, and armed with guns and weaponry, meets the people already living on the land that it covets and wishes to take over? The answer is another round of the policy that has been called Indian removal. The process was brutally road-tested in Florida. The First and Second Seminole Wars were not just about land, they were deeply entangled with the institution of slavery. Plantation owners in Georgia and the Carolinas were terrified by the presence of a powerful, autonomous Seminole nation that offered refuge to escaped slaves. Free black people and escaped slaves, known as Black Seminoles, lived and fought alongside the Seminole Native Americans, creating a powerful alliance that horrified the slave-owning South. U.S. Commander General Thomas Jessup was explicit, calling the Second Seminole War, quote, a Negro, not an Indian war, end quote. And he feared that if the Seminoles weren't crushed, the rebellion would spread to plantations across the South. These wars were long, they were bloody, they were expensive, but they established a model. Use military force to remove Native American peoples and secure land for white settlement and slavery. It is a removal model that was used over and over again. This model was applied on a massive scale once there was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act gave President Andrew Jackson the authority to negotiate treaties to exchange Native American lands in the East for territory west of the Mississippi River. Publicly, Jackson framed this as a benevolent paternalistic policy. We had discussed this in a previous episode. He claimed that the removal would, quote, separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlement of whites, and that it protected them, allowing them to become more Christian and civilized. Those were his words, which of course was nonsense. The Cherokee Nation provided the most tragic refutation of this claim, and more than any other group, the Cherokee had actively embraced the civilization policy. They developed the written language. They adopted a constitution modeled on the United States Constitution. Many converted to Christianity. They became successful farmers, and in some cases, they even became slaveholders themselves. They used American tools to defend their rights, including lawsuits and petitions. In fact, in an 1836 petition protesting their removal, Cherokee leaders laid out the bitter irony of their situation. Quote, you asked us to throw off the hunter and warrior state. We did so. You asked us to form a republican government. We did so. You asked us to cultivate the earth. We did so. Now you demand we cede our lands. That we will not do. End quote. Their pleas and their use for equality in the justice system were ignored. Under President Martin Van Buren, the U.S. military enforced their removal. In the winters of 1838 and 39, some 16,000 Cherokees were forced to march westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. The journey was devastating. Overloaded, undersupplied, it was racked with disease, and at least 4,000 people, and I would argue probably more, died along the trek. This was not for their protection, nor did it protect them at all. This was a death march, driven by land greed and justified by the ideology of manifest destiny. This history forces us to rethink about how we talk about the West. The traditional story, popularized by historian Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893, is the frontier thesis. Turner saw the West as a process, a moving line between what he called, quote, savagery and civilization. He argued that this process of taming the wilderness created American democracy and individualism, and that it all came to a neat close around 1890 when the frontier line disappeared. But in the late 20th century, a group of scholars known as the New Western Historians powerfully challenged this narrative. Historian Patricia Nelson Limerick, in her book, The Legacy of Conquest, argues that we should think of the West not as a process that ended, but as a place with an unbroken past. For Limerick, the story of the West is not a romantic adventure. It's actually a story of conquest, and the consequences of that conquest over land, water, over resources, and specifically over race, are still with us and haunt us today. The West isn't a closed chapter. It's a place where the conflicts of the 19th century continued to play out. Another key historian, Richard White, introduced the concept of the middle ground. Now, he focused on the Great Lakes region, and he showed that while the story there wasn't always one of simple conquest, it was often a complex dance of negotiation, accommodation, and a creative misunderstanding, we might say, between Native Americans and Europeans. They built a shared world, a middle ground where neither side could fully dominate the other. So together, these historians force us to see the West as never something that was empty. It was never an empty land really waiting to be settled or even civilized. It was a crowded, complex place. Hundreds of different nations lived there and called it their own homes. And the story of the westward expansion is not a simple, heroic tale of progress, but a complicated and often brutal story of violence and conquest, of displacement, of enduring legacies that we still feel the echoes of today. Manifest Destiny's next target after Native American groups was this sister republic next door, Mexico. And the quest for the land that Mexico had owned would push the United States into a war that many, including a young Abraham Lincoln, saw as a profound betrayal of American ideals. The story begins, as so many do in this era, in Texas. After Mexico encouraged American settlement in the 1820s, tensions quickly rose over slavery, which Mexico had outlawed prior to this, and the settlers who came to this Texas area refused to abide by Mexican law. This friction culminated in the Texas Revolution of 1836. It's often portrayed as a simple conflict between Anglo-Texans and Mexicans, but in reality it was much more complex. Many Tejanos, Texicans of Mexican descent, also fought for an independent Texas. One of the most prominent was Juan Seguín, a respected leader from San Antonio. Seguín raised a company of Tejano volunteers and fought bravely throughout the revolution. At a memorial for the fallen defenders of the Alamo in 1837, he declared, quote, "Companions in arms thus remains which we have the honor of carrying on our shoulders are those of the brave heroes who died in the Alamo. I invite you to declare to the entire world, Texas shall be free and independent, or we shall perish in glorious combat." End quote. But his story ends in tragedy. After Texas won its independence, the flood of Anglo-American immigrants brought with them intense racial prejudice. Despite his service in fighting for that Texas independence, he and other Tejanos were viewed with suspicion and hostility. He was accused of being a traitor, and he was forced to flee the very nation he had fought to create. He would later write of his painful exile, lamenting that he was, in his own words, quote, "a foreigner in my native land," end quote. His experience was a bitter testament to the racial hierarchy that Manifest Destiny was imposing on the West. The Texas question festered for nearly a decade. Presidents Jackson and Van Buren resisted annexation, fearing that it would mean war with Mexico, and more importantly, that it would ignite the explosive issues of slavery in the national politics. But the expansionist president James K. Polk had no such qualms about this. He pushed annexation through, and in 1845, Texas became a state. War was now pretty much inevitable. The United States and Mexico disputed the southern border of Texas. Mexico claimed that it was the Nueces River, the historical boundary, while the U.S. and Texas claimed the Rio Grande, 150 miles further south. In early 1846, President Polk, who had his eyes on acquiring California as well, ordered General Zachary Taylor and his troops into the disputed territory, a clear provocation. On April 25th of 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked an American patrol. Polk now had his pretext for war. On May 11th, he sent a dramatic war message to Congress declaring, quote, "The cup of forbearance has been exhausted. After reiterated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil." End quote. The phrase was electric. American blood on American soil. Congress, swept up in patriotic war fervor, quickly declared war. But not everyone was convinced. The freshman Whig congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, stood up and challenged the president. In a series of resolutions that became known as the Spot Resolutions, Lincoln demanded that Polk identify the exact spot on the map where blood was shed. He asked, quote, "whether that spot is or is not within a settlement of people, which settlement had existed ever since long before the Texas Revolution, whether the people of that settlement have ever submitted themselves to the government or laws of Texas or of the United States," end quote. Lincoln was implying that many suspected at the same time that the spot was not American soil at all, but Mexican territory, inhabited by Mexicans, and that Polk was deliberately provoking a war. Lincoln's resolutions were tabled, but his skepticism had been validated by modern historians, like scholar Amy Greenberg in her book, A Wicked War. And she argues forcefully that the conflict was exactly what Lincoln suspected. It was a war of conquest, engineered by the president, and started with a presidential lie. Greenberg shows that Polk was driven by a greedy, imperialistic vision of Manifest Destiny, and was determined to acquire California by war if necessary. The claim that, quote, American blood had been shed on American soil was a deliberate deception to rally a reluctant country to an aggressive war. The conflict was not a defense of American territory, it was an invasion of Mexico. The war was a decisive victory for the United States, and in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded a vast territory, what is now the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. It lost nearly half its land. The United States had fulfilled its manifest destiny to stretch from sea to shining sea. But as we'll see, though, this victory came at a terrible price. The war with Mexico gave the United States California, and just days after the treaty was signed, a discovery there would trigger one of the most frantic migrations in world history. But the gold rush was not just the story of plucky 49ers, I wonder where that San Francisco team got its name. It was a global event that revealed the violent, racist underbelly of Manifest Destiny's promise. In January of 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. The news spread like wildfire, and a flood of people poured into California searching for gold. The population out west exploded. San Francisco went from a sleepy village of about 500 people in 1848 to a booming, chaotic metropolis of nearly 50,000 people just 5 years later. These migrants came from all over the world, not just out east. They came from Europe, from Latin America, and in huge numbers from China. This gold mountain, as the Chinese called it, was no paradise. It was a place of lawlessness. There was tons of racial conflict and brutal, violent exploitation. While white Americans often saw themselves as the rightful owners and managers of the mine, they relegated ethnic minorities to the hardest and least profitable labor. This was especially true for the thousands of Chinese immigrants who arrived also seeking their fortune. They faced intense discrimination and violence, as well as legal injustices. We are fortunate to have a powerful first-hand account of this experience. In 1860, a Chinese merchant named Pun Chi wrote a petition to the U.S. Congress pleading for protection of himself and his countrymen. His words paint a harrowing picture. He wrote, quote, "We Chinese are viewed like thieves and enemies. As we go on our way, we are pushed and kicked and struck by the drunken and the brutal. Robbers strip and plunder, wound, and even murder some of us." End quote. Pun Chi detailed how Chinese miners were extorted by boatmen, cheated out of their claims by Americans, and had their gold stolen by robbers they dared not resist. Most damningly, he pointed to the root of the problem, a legal system that refused to even recognize their basic humanity. He wrote, quote, "When in the administration of justice our testimony is not received, villains of other nations are encouraged to rob and do violence to us." End quote. The gold that was supposed to bring prosperity and fulfill the promise of the West instead created a landscape of racialized violence, where the blessings of liberty were reserved only for whites. The ideology of Manifest Destiny was not confined to the North American continent. Its logic of American superiority and hemispheric dominance had been articulated decades earlier in the Monroe Doctrine, which we had talked about, which warned European powers to stay out of the Americas. By the 1850s, this impulse took on a more radical and sinister form with the phenomenon of filibustering. These were privately funded military expeditions, essentially pirate invasions, launched by American adventurers to seize foreign territory. Men like William Walker tried to conquer parts of Nicaragua and establish new slave regimes, while others dreamed of capturing Cuba for the United States. Though these schemes often failed, and they ultimately did fail, they show the boundless imperialistic ambitions that Manifest Destiny had unleashed, an ambition now explicitly tied to the expansion of slavery. And that brings us to the dark heart of the matter. Manifest Destiny was a powerful engine of national growth, a force that pushed the United States across the continent and onto the world stage. But it was an idea fueled by a toxic mix of democratic idealism and racial supremacy. It led to the violent dispossession of Native Americans, a war for conquest against Mexico, and the creation of new arenas for racial conflict and exploitation. And in the end, it brought the nation to the brink of self-destruction. Ralph Waldo Emerson had seen it coming. As the Mexican-American War began, he wrote in his journal a very chilling and prophetic line, quote, "We will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic which will bring him down in turn. Mexico will poison us," end quote. The poison, as it turned out, wasn't Mexico or Mexicans themselves. The poison was the questions that came with all of the new land, with all the new territory acquired in the name of Manifest Destiny. Specifically, would this be free or would it be slave? Every new acre acquired, from Texas to California, became a battleground in the escalating, irrepressible conflict over the future of slavery in these United States. The dream of a continental empire had inadvertently laid the path to a possible national suicide. The next time on Star-Spangled Studies, we'll see just how that poison worked its way through the body politic as we dive headfirst into this sectional crisis. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.